When Jung claims, for example, that you throw the baby out with the bathwater when you're trying to develop and become a socially acceptable personality, that happens in a different way as far as he's concerned for each of the genders. And so one of the prices Jung would say that we pay, and that this is a very modern idea in some ways, for growing up as a distinctly gendered society, is that it's very easy for men to suppress and fail to develop those elements of their character that might be considered classically feminine, and it's difficult for women to develop and express those aspects of their personality that might be classically considered masculine. But so Jung believed that nested inside the shadow, in some sense, were the contrasexual capacities. So, for example, for a man, given what we know about the temperamental difference between men and women, it may be that men could develop the capacity for true compassion and care if they could find that ability within what they've thrown out in the shadow. And women, for example, could find the capacity to be aggressive and assertive because that's part of what they threw out during their course of development because of its a priori categorization as inappropriate behavior. Now, that doesn't mean that Jung thought that that people should be raised without any gender identity. That issue never came up for him. He just thought that once you had established a personality that was sufficiently developed to be acceptable socially and functional on the individual level, then you could have the opportunity to expand that personality and to take into yourself elements of perception and thought and behavior that you wouldn't have had the sophistication to be able to handle at an earlier stage of development. So Jung would say, perhaps, that if you're a male, you have to become masculine before you could become feminine. And if you were a female, the reverse is true. But that if your development only stops with a narrow and categorical gender identity, then there are elements of being that you could draw on that aren't at your disposal, and that will make you weak. So the shadow breaks up into the anima and the animus, and the anima is the female inside the male, so to speak, and the animus is the male inside the female. And Jung believed that he could see those partial spirits manifesting themselves in people's behavior. And so he talked about a couple of typical behaviors that he thought were associated either with anima possession, so that would be in the case of a man, or animus possession in the case of a woman. And so he would regard, if you ever talk to someone who's female, who seems to respond to all of your propositions with nothing but argumentation for the sake of argumentation, Jung would regard that as a manifestation of possession by the animus. And if you ever talk to a man who is irrationally possessed by second-rate and futile emotions, then he would regard that as possession by the anima. So, and you can see that if you watch for it, and if you believe in such things. The best thing to do when confronted with someone whose animus possessed is just shut up, because you're not going to make any headway, because the point of the argument, of an animus-inspired argument, is to get you to argue, not to win. Because by getting you to argue, the animus wins.
The anima, the animus, and premature integration. It's going to be a fun topic to talk about. Now, when we're looking at premature integration, that is when an individual, now let's say you are a heterosexual man, you're a straight man, you want to view yourself as masculine. That is part of how you present yourself, and you do not want to be ultimately effeminate and submissive, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just saying that typically if you're a man, you're going to have leanings in a particular direction, and typically for a woman, she's going to have leanings in a particular direction. But what can happen along the way is if you encounter certain traumas when you're young, or certain leadership or guidance that isn't proper, then you're going to be given advice or encounter things in life that damage your primary mode within the sexual polarity quadrant, right? There's something to understand. So like, let's say you're a man. If you're a man, the first thing you learn is where you're being socialized, you're going to be socially programmed unless you're living in a particular environment. And that environment can lead to being hyper in the animus or hyper in your masculine without being too wounded to be able to eventually tap into the feminine. But I'm going to explain what I mean by this. So the animus, that is the internal masculine, right? That's the internal masculine, especially like for a woman, and she has the internal masculine that if this is repressed or it's tapped into in the wrong way, it can cause her to be combative. It can cause her to be overly rigid and structured. It can cause her to be hyper against herself at times. There's a lot of things that go along with this, and there's different levels of that progression through the animus and the anima, right? And for a man, when you're a man or you're a boy and you're seeking to become a man, what can happen along the way is premature integration, where you may exhibit more feminine traits because you haven't learned to tap into your masculinity or your dominance, right? So look at it in this particular way. We live in a society that puts a heavy emphasis on androgyny, right? Premature integration. And this is something that leads to a lot of what people consider narcissistic and codependent relationship dynamics, right? Because it's a lack of getting into a place of alignment, and the need for things to appear equal can cause people to be, let's say, a masculine submissive who attracts the opposite energy, which would be a feminine dominant. Then the masculine submissive will tend to turn into a codependent, and then the feminine dominant will turn into the narcissist. That's typically how it works. And it could be a man or a woman on either side of that. Or a masculine submissive can attract another masculine submissive because that's what they're seeking to find, right? And in finding this particular person, they may cancel out, right? So let's say a masculine submissive finds a masculine submissive. Neither one of them wants to fully tap into the dominant role, and neither person wants to fully tap into the feminine role. So no one's in true alignment, and oftentimes this leads to a perception of a lack of sexual compatibility, which isn't based on the people themselves, but the way that they are approaching their role and their dynamic within the relationship. And this can lead to it appearing that two people are sexually incompatible when they don't necessarily have to be. Because from my point of view, I look at submissive as the primary giver of control and the primary receiver of pleasure. The dominant is the primary giver of control, is the primary receiver of control and the primary giver of pleasure. And when as a man, you're more so focused on receiving pleasure, and that's your primary mode of how you're operating within the sexual polarity quadrant, then oftentimes that can put you into a position of being submissive. So you're giving control of the flow and the type of sex that you're having to a woman, when it's going to take place. She's in control of that. And then as she's in control of that, you're not willing to walk away if you're not getting what you want. So you are giving up control from a stifled place. It's not the feminine submissiveness, which is in alignment because you still seek to be masculine, right? You still want to view yourself as masculine. You're just in a submissive position. Oftentimes, this is premature integration. So premature integration for a man is when you're growing up, instead of having the opportunity and the knowledge and the skill set to develop your masculine traits, to develop your dominance as a man, you fail to exceed at that. And because you fail to succeed at this, you begin to adopt more feminine or submissive traits. Right? And as you adopt these traits, society encourages you as a man to tap into your feminine side, to be more emotional. There's nothing wrong with being emotional, all these different things. And oftentimes you just end up becoming a weak man. And then women who have dealt with men who are overly into their masculine without being able to integrate their anima into their personality, they will speak double talk, right? So when they're speaking, I wish men need to learn how to communicate better. They're not talking about you. You're not a masculine man. You're not a dominant man. She's speaking of a man who's in his masculine dominant energy, who knows what he wants, who's the primary giver of pleasure. And she wants this man to give her the validation so that she can feel complete, so she can feel integrated in this relationship dynamic with this man. But something that also happens is this double talk, because for a man who isn't fully in his masculine or isn't fully in his dominance, his masculine dominance, in alignment with himself as a man, this particular type of man is the man who she seeks to drain, right? She seeks to drain him emotionally and energetically. She seeks to be an energy vampire, an attention whore, right? So she may want to drain you of financial compensation, emotional validation, and social validation. And no one's telling you that you haven't learned to step into and walk into your masculinity. And the woman's not going to really tell you until you're too hurt to listen to what she's really trying to tell you. But a woman who's seeking to take advantage of your weakness is not going to tell you, because she wants to take advantage of your weakness. Right? So she's going to tell you to do the same things that she would really desire from a man who she views as her dominant. So this is premature integration. Right? And because your anima is, you're too heavily into your feminine, that's going to attract the woman who's probably going to be operating out of being possessed by her animus, which means she's going to be combative, which means that she's going to be difficult, which means that she's going to be overly structured and not being open or willing to be malleable to what you're trying to do. Right? Because there's premature integration, then there's a lack of integration. That premature integration is when you overly identify with the opposite traits of what you are due to your lack of success in being what you are. So like, let's say there's a woman and she is meant to be feminine, right? That's how she would like to view herself. But it's difficult for her because she lives in a society that encourages women to be more masculine or to be more dominant. So for her, she doesn't feel safe. That pseudo-masculine energy is a defense mechanism meant to protect herself from making bad decisions, because she's made bad decisions with men before. And because she's never adequately learned to tap into her feminine side and to experience what it likes to experience the dominance of a man who's masculine, all she understands is that when she was in her femininity, she was taken advantage of. It was a feminine dominant man. Because she was in her femininity, she was taken advantage of. So now she wants to be masculine, logical, structured, in order to be in control of herself, her decisions in the relationship dynamic, which in turn will attract men who are seeking a challenge, feminine dominance, or attract men who are seeking to be submissive with her, which she will not respect or truly be attracted to. She might appreciate what they're giving to her as far as the emotional validation, social validation, and financial compensation, but she may never truly respect this man as a man or respect him as a leader, which is different from giving someone basic human respect. It's a different level of respect that comes with putting someone in a leadership position. Like when it comes to the integrating of the anima, first there is sex. Then there is romance. Then there's love. Then there's wisdom. To be 100% logical and practical is something that will oftentimes lead to a lack of having true emotional intelligence or understanding of life. Right? If you're overly logical, you'll often be limited. Limited in a variety of ways. But one of those main ways is a lack of an ability to integrate into a relationship. If you find a woman who's willing to be feminine and submissive with you, And then your idea is that you want to stay into the masculine. You want to stay into the dominant. You don't want to integrate. You don't know how to lead into that being a situation you would want to be with. You just use that woman pretty much just as, just a fuck toy. And there's nothing wrong with just having sexual relationships. But I'm a big proponent of leaving women better than you found them. I think that's an important thing to understand. As well as if that's a woman who you'd want to be with, being able to teach her the things that are necessary. It's not just good dick, it's good dick and guidance. That's what leads to that natural response of submissiveness. It's desire and respect. When a woman respects you as a man, respects you as a leader, and desires you sexually, that's when she will tap in to that submissive energy, where she'll be having, easier time with orgasms, but also respecting your leadership, your mindset, your guidance, the direction that you want to go in. She starts to mold herself to you, to shape herself after you in a way. And that kind of taps more into, let's talk about the Animus. And the Animus in integration works like this. Once you get integrated in a relationship, you're going to be more tapped into your Anima. Now, as a man, you're going to be operating primarily out of the masculine and primarily out of the dominant. But as you integrate, first comes sex, then comes romance, then comes love, then comes wisdom. As you experience these different things, then there are going to be different aspects of femininity and submissiveness that you release to the woman that you're with, who you vetted and who's worthy and who deserves that. But likewise, a woman has to be a certain level of integrated herself in order to do that. And what I mean by this is, there's a certain level of masculinity that's good for a woman to have. There's a certain level of dominance that's good for a woman to have. Right? It's a certain level that's good. It's just that when she's not in touch with her animus, or she had a very restrictive father, or she has certain social programming. And what social programming really is, the anima typically is expressed by a man's idealizations and mechanizations of the ideal woman in his mind, right? Maybe ideal, maybe not so ideal. But there's a figurehead of a woman in his mind that he thinks about when he pictures the nature of a woman, right? Now, for a woman, it's typically going to be several men. So this could be an over fixation on religious principles that may not even be accurate with her beliefs. Some type of tradition, some type of moral values that are very strong that limit her ability to tap into her femininity and her submissiveness when it would be necessary or when it would be prudent, because there's a fear of her femininity, right? So this particular type of woman, it may be that. Sometimes it's just the social programming. And that social programming is typically the thoughts of several dead men, or the society that she lives in, certain pervasive thought processes, prevalent thought processes, and the structures of the social structures that she's in. The way that the typical thought process and logic of her environment thinks. So when you understand this aspect of things, we can say that for some women, they're in a place where they feel deeply unprotected, so that the way that they deal with this by feeling unsafe is either to be extremely defensive or to be extremely offensive, right? So this is where a lot of the Delilah syndrome will come from. But there is a certain level of masculinity and dominance that's good for a woman to have, right? And that comes in a more integrated with the animus state. But you first have to tap into what your natural gender predisposition is. So let's say that you are a man. You have to first learn masculinity, learn dominance. Then you integrate from there. When you prematurely integrate, it's where you drink the Kool-Aid about not caring about gender roles, not necessarily gender roles, because gender roles and polarity aren't the same thing, but not caring about sexual polarity, wanting to be overly caught up in the idea of symmetry, thinking that if you are what you want directly, that it's going to attract what you want. Like thinking if you're a man who just wants love and affection and a relationship, that you're going to attract a woman who just wants love and affection and a relationship. It doesn't often work that way. because there's a certain level of your sexuality that may be repressed within you, knowing when you first see a woman that you're sexually attracted to her, but you are projecting your anima onto her and this idealization of woman onto her to think that she is worthy of more than she truly is. So instead of being honest with the fact that what you truly see is someone you're attracted to, you put this woman on a pedestal where you see her as the ideal of female perfection. That woman can't maintain that or keep up with that. But you're also rejecting the opportunity to get to know her sexual shadow, to get to know her true submissive ego, to get to know who she truly is, because you're putting this idealization on her. And you may attract a woman who does the same to you. Right? And that's why it's a process of integration, and not that just fall in love at first sight type of shit. Not saying that it can never happen like that. It can, but most of the time that's limerence. Most of the time that's infatuation. Most of the time that's not real. So when we're looking at these different aspects of the anima and the animus, when a woman taps into the more positive aspects of her animus, the masculinity that's repressed inside of her, she can gain more of an ability to be assertive towards the outside world, but still following your leadership, still submissive to you as a man, but ultimately adopting some of your beliefs and having her own idiosyncrasies where she can think for herself, but what she thinks is in line with you. When she's trying to develop more of her mindset about how she wants to do things, she has a certain level of malleability to what your program is, to what the direction that you want to go in is. And then when it comes to even when you're not around, the masculinity has been built up so that she can maintain a certain level of masculinity to other men when you're not around. Which is where a woman can give herself to you, but when another man comes into the vicinity who is trying to also have access to her, it's not that she's in a constant state of being overly feminine and submissive to the point where she's open to inner energy that comes around to the point where she gets the feminine dominance, right? But it's a matter of she has concentrated that feminine submissiveness into the primary point of loving herself and of loving the man that she's with. So she no longer has to hold back on the femininity and submissiveness when it comes to you. She is reserved with that when it comes to people outside of your relationship dynamic. Right? And that's more so in a monogamous type of dynamic, but it also works that way to a certain extent in polyamory, because there's different types of swinger and polyamorous relationships, right? You know, one type is where you're pretty much being gaslit and manipulated by a woman who's not interested in you, or you accept the feminine submissive role yourself, or you just are being tricked into a scenario where a woman wants to maintain the emotional security of having you as an emotional safety net while she wants to explore her more lustful desires with others. But then there's also an aspect of it where you are the primary aspect of it, and that's the way that you want to live. You're the primary focal point of where she gets to be feminine and submissive, and she may just be sexually masculine submissive, or she may be feminine dominant when it comes to other men, or maybe she's masculine and dominant when it comes to other men, or masculine and dominant when it comes to other women. But that's a different type of dynamic. That's when we get more into the conversations about polyamory, non-monogamy, swinger relationships, and different things that are like, unicorn hunting, all those different things. Right? But likewise, when you tap into more of this integration yourself as a man, you get to the point where you have a certain level of intrinsic desire and reward. See, that's where the feminine submissiveness, it's intrinsic desire and reward that comes with having a certain level of femininity or love and compassion towards your woman, having a certain level of emotional intelligence and wisdom for your woman, having a certain level of desire and pleasure that you receive and derive from your woman. See, that's the integration of it, right? And that integration of it, like I said, it starts with sex, then it's romance, then it's love, then it's wisdom. When you integrate the anima. But this may not be something that is going to be towards every single person that you come across. See, the feminine submissive And I'll say this part right here. Typically how things work is when a man views a woman, the first thing he's thinking is sex, right? A woman may not be thinking that with every man that she comes across. Understand that. To be masculine and dominant as a man, typically you are going to be the primary giver of pleasure sexually, but you can be upfront about your sexual intentions if that's what you want, right? And then the integration is when you build an emotional connection with this woman to where she's emotional first, she is. She's submissive first, she is. But then over time, you vet this woman, you get to know this woman, and then the non-sexual aspect is something that you intrinsically enjoy for the sake of doing it. That means you can go out and do something, and you're not doing it because you're trying to get sex out of your actions and your behaviors. You're doing it because you genuinely enjoy her time and her company. See, that's the feminine submissive from a male side. The feminine submissive from a woman typically is going to be that place of intrinsic sexual desire and intrinsic sexual motivation. A sexual motivation that isn't transactional, but it's intrinsic, right? An intrinsic sexual attraction that isn't transactional, but intrinsic. And this sexual attraction that isn't transactional, but intrinsic is the one that's going to be more sustainable, but it's also going to hit into much deeper levels because the intrinsic is the feminine submissive, right? The transactional is the masculine submissive. Masculinity stifles submissiveness, but femininity corrupts dominance. And that's where the more duplicitous mindset comes from. That's where the more aggressive aspects come from. Not aggressive in a positive way, but another aspect of a woman tapping into her animus in a positive way is that you'll have a program, you'll have a direction that you want to go in. You talk and you consider the things that she wants to do, and you push her towards her own dreams, her goals, and her passions, instead of her being simply a damsel in distress who's looking for you to fix everything. You're more so a leader, you're a guider, you're an advisor, you're a coach. I'm Coach Brody. So in being in this particular place, you can give her some direction that helps her go on the path that she's already heading down. Pursuing her dreams, her aspirations, her goals, she becomes more creative. She's inspired, you're a muse to her, right? But another aspect of her tapping into the dominance would be that she learns you. You know her body on a very high level. You learn her body, but you're the primary giver of pleasure so that you can take her further in her body than she can take herself. And that's where you really get to the primary giver of pleasure dominant space. It's where you can give her a higher level of pleasure than she can find for herself. And she may be able to find the pleasure itself alone better in someone else, but the femininity lubricates the submissiveness. So the fact that she's feminine and submissive with you is probably going to make that the greatest level of pleasure that she's received in that period of time. Because you can't really be feminine submissive with multiple people without eventually leading to feminine dominance. Understand that. So, and it's possible, but it's just unlikely, right? Just like people say that you can love more than one person at a time, that's platonic love. And that's often can be a certain level of the masculine submissive, although has a certain level of intrinsic to it. But that goes more so along with the social mask, the social values. At times, that's more of a familial, platonic type of love. But to be in love is typically something that most people aren't going to experience with multiple people at the same time, because you're going to either love one master and hate the other, or you're going to cling to one and resent the other. That's just how it typically works. So there's ways of just understanding that general rule of thumb. You know, things can work differently to a certain extent, but there's ways you have to finesse it when it comes to like polyamorous relationships. Right? Because two dominant people, especially two masculine dominants who have separate programs, they'll be pulling you in different directions. And then you're going to have to choose which direction you're going to go in, unless you choose yourself. But by choosing yourself, then you won't be able to deal with the dominant individual pretty much at all. You'll then become incompatible due to the two people being masculine or dominant at the same time. There's something that will clash or create toxic relationships where there's a battle going on, power struggles. But as we're looking at these different dynamics, premature integration is what it puts a man too much in his head to where you neglect your body, you neglect your phallus, you neglect your dick, right? You neglect your dominance, you neglect your own masculine desires and wants and interests and your own ego, right? The ego isn't always bad. You want to integrate your ego, you want a healthy ego, and you can go too far into neglecting your ego. So this is Coach Brody on the Anima, the Animus, sexual integration and premature integration. I'm out.